Since our discussions today will be focusing on Russia, I'd like to begin with a look at Japan-Russia relations. Specifically, how do you see the COVID-19 pandemic impacting those relations?
The biggest impact that the COVID-19 has had on the Japan-Russia relations is that Prime Minister Abe had to cancel his scheduled visit to Moscow, where he planned to attend the anniversary of the Soviet victories, World War II victories. He wanted to have another summit meeting with President Putin in order to reactivate the stalled negotiation on the signing peace treaty. But unfortunately, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, he had to cancel his visit to Moscow. In my view, there are two pillars that for Japan's foreign policy toward Russia. One is signing peace treaty, which would resolve the territorial issue, and another is that essentially the China factor. Japan wants to improve the relationship with Russia in order to create the more favorable strategic environment in this region in order to contend with rapidly rising China. When Prime Minister Abe returned to government at the end of 2012, actually Russia had also a similar strategic view. China's rapid rise could cause a future potential threat to Russia. In this strategic context, Prime Minister Abe started his aggressive foreign policy toward Russia.
You mentioned China, and one of the defining factors in the region is the relationship between Russia and China. Could you describe some of the key factors in this relationship, including areas where there's cooperation and perhaps areas of contention?
Before that, let me explain how Japan-Russia relations deteriorated. Unfortunately, after the crisis in Ukraine, the relationship between United States and Russia deteriorated rapidly. United States and European countries imposed sanctions to Russia. Japan also joined in this sanction. Also, Japan's sanctions are milder than those of the United States and Europe. This essentially pushed Russia into the arms of China. Russia had to improve its relationship with China and ultimately dependence on China, especially regarding the economy and technology. In the US, there was a slight expectation that Trump administration would improve the relationship with Russia. However, due to several reasons, including the alleged intervention by Russia into the US presidential election in 2016, that expectation didn't come to fruition. And now the United States designed not only China, but also Russia as a revisionist power challenging US world order. Actually, Russia has a common interest with China, namely a hope to challenge and ultimately bring to the end the US-led world order. However, Russia as a great power country always wants to preserve its own sovereignty in making decisions on internal and external policy. To maintain this freedom, Russia doesn't want to much dependence on China economically and politically. So I would say that current Russia-China relations is more than a strategic partnership, but less than formal military alliance.
The competition between China and the United States is another defining factor of global issues. How do you see Russia fitting into this ongoing competition between the US and China? And what are Russia's strategic interests in this case?
Yes, since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, competition between the United States and China over the global leadership has seriously intensified, and there is a view that in the near future, some kind of the new bipolar world between the United States and China will emerge. At this moment, Russia doesn't have the option to worsen its relationship with China. However, as I mentioned, Russia wants to keep its own independent, strategic independence, not only from the United States, but also from China, and maintain its position as an independent strategic player in the global politics. So actually this dynamism will be the biggest challenge for Russia's foreign policy in the coming decades.
And given the fact that this international situation is continuously changing and evolving, what are some of the key points you'll be watching moving forward?
Yes, first of all, I'll be watching to see which country is the earliest one to recover from this pandemic. The earlier, the better. And the country that can recover from this crisis earlier than others could take a more favorable and stronger position in global politics. And also, we have to follow how the competition between the United States and China over global leadership continue to develop. This will inevitably affect global politics and international relations. Japan-Russia relations are no exception.